Less than a quarter of a century ago, medical conditions in China were, by any standards, utterly appalling. Today, I don't think anyone could travel in China, even in the remote areas, without feeling that the Chinese are among the healthiest people in the world. And this is especially true, of course, of the young people, those who were born since 1949. In the course of this program, I shall be talking to a doctor originally from America, who has lived for almost 40 years in China, and who had personally much to do with the establishment and development of the medical services available to the Chinese. China, of course, has not by any means overcome all her public health and medical problems, but to have established a medical service available to 700 or 800 million people, and in a country that was so poor and technically backward, is a very remarkable achievement. The courtyard of the Hospital for Traditional Medicine in Peking. The big sign is a quotation from Chairman Mao. It says, "Chinese medicine and pharmacology are a great treasure house. Efforts should be made to explore them and raise them to a higher level." 5,000 outpatients are treated in this hospital every day. The methods and medicines, very different from our own, have been practiced for many centuries. Traditional Chinese medicine relies a great deal, not only on acupuncture, but on a great variety of wild herbs and plants, which are not costly and grow in great abundance. The nurses call this our homemade computer. So many herbal prescriptions are prepared here every day that they worked out this ingenious way of automatically weighing and assembling the herbs. Literally hundreds of modern hospitals for Western-style medicine have been built in China since the revolution. Previously, Peking had only one modern hospital, used mostly by foreigners and upper-class Chinese. Today, there are over 40 new hospitals in Peking alone. Though not luxurious, they are well equipped and fully staffed. The national policy today is to break down the division between Western and Chinese medical methods. Some Chinese doctors trained in Western medical techniques still tend to look down on traditional medical practices as being unscientific. But these attitudes are changing, and you now often see doctors trained in Western and traditional medicine conferring on a case as they are doing here in a Shanghai hospital. All medical students now have instruction in both kinds of medicine. Here, the traditional doctor is explaining to the other the advantage of using a flexible splint rather than a plaster cast. Historically, it was China's enormous peasant population that stood most urgently in need of an adequate medical service. And in 1965, the main medical emphasis was shifted to the rural areas. Today, 75% of all medical graduates work in the country. Almost every commune or county now has at least one fairly well-equipped hospital with fully trained doctors. But these central hospitals could not possibly provide a medical service for all of China's 600 million peasants, many of whom live in widely scattered villages. In almost every village, there are now simple clinics such as this one. From among the peasants, young men and women are chosen to undergo a short period of intensive training at a central hospital. They return to their village, able to deal with all minor ailments and inoculations, and they know enough to recognize cases of serious illness, which are then sent to the commune hospital. There are now well over 1 million of these peasants, who are known as barefoot doctors. It's a picturesque name, but quite misleading, for I never saw one of them, or anyone else in China for that matter, walking barefoot. Medical services are now nationwide. Here, we are close to the Burma border, miles away from any city. Many different nationalities live in this area, and they still wear their native dress. This is a fully qualified doctor of the Han nationality. This man is a barefoot doctor of the Thai nationality. The cost to the peasants for medical services is very low. Most of them join a medical cooperative, and for 60 cents a year are fully covered for all medical costs. In every part of rural China, groups, under the supervision of a pharmacist, collect herbs from the countryside, which are brought to the clinic or hospital to be made into medicines. Most village clinics also have a pharmacy for Western medicines. But the medical advances in China cannot really be judged unless one recalls the wretched conditions of the peasants before the revolution. A century of exploitation by the Western powers and the invasion by Japan had brought the people to unimaginable suffering. Conditions of work, for those who had work, were often appalling. Rickshaw drivers had a working life expectancy of just 8 years. Uprooted by the war or driven by starvation, thousands of peasants flocked to the already overcrowded cities. For the millions who required medical attention, there were no doctors or hospitals or medicines. Even when floods brought widespread epidemics, the number who could be inoculated was small. A very remarkable American doctor, Dr. Ma Ha-te, has been in China since long before the revolution, and he has ever since been closely associated with the Chinese in building up the new medical services. He was especially involved with a nationwide program that finally succeeded in eliminating all venereal disease in China. I recently had a talk with him in Peking.
When I first went to the northwestern part of China, that is the Shanxi, Gansu area, it was in a period of civil war yet, and I was supposed to be the famous doctor coming in to cure all the illnesses. At that time, even there weren't any medical services in the countryside at all. None at all. And in the Red Army were the only ones providing any rural services, medical services at all. And those army doctors were trained in their own medical schools. They had to do everything from delivering babies to treating wounded, and with very, very little equipment. All our doctors were trained at a maximum of 8 months, and they served throughout the whole Civil War, the whole War of Liberation, with not more than a dozen actually qualified medical personnel. But the biggest problem was that the people were so undernourished, so tired, so worn out, that no matter what you did for them medically, you had to solve the problem of feeding them, really.
At that point, I asked Dr. Ma what happened after the revolution. The new government was faced with the need to do something for many hundreds of millions of people who had no organized medical services at all. How did they begin to tackle the problem?
Well, the first thing they did was they sat down and decided that they were going to provide medical services for all these people.
They did?
Yeah.
That was the basic decision?
That's the basic decision. Once they decided that, they had to get on with the job. I think the real leaps where you noted qualitative changes in the medical services, the earliest one came at the beginning, of course, when they decided that they're going to treat all the people and provide a health service for everybody. But the second period came during the Korean War. And there was inaugurated at that time one of the famous mass movements, the patriotic health movement, getting rid of the 4 pests Hygiene among
What were the four pests?
There was flies, mosquitoes, rats, and sparrows. But we relieved the sparrows. We re-liberated them. They weren't as culpable as they should have been, were thought to be. And we substituted bedbugs.
Ah.
But, and then there was a whole educational movement on hygiene, both personal and environmental hygiene. Control of water, supplies, wells, feces control, fertilizer, composting, and personal habits. You had to change the whole concept of a people's hygienic mentality. After being so subjected to superstition and lack of knowledge of where diseases came from. Well, I think that period laid a very strong foundation so that this habit took hold, and at many times during the year now, at holidays, spring festivals, all there's big house cleaning, general environmental cleanup, and so forth. The second period, I think, was during the Great Leap Forward.
What happened there?
The Great Leap Forward contributed mostly in medicine to a number of things. One of the major things it did was highly organize the rural population so that on the one hand they could be helped, on the other hand they could help themselves. Instead of dealing with an individual family or a cooperative of 50 people, here you had a commune of 20,000, 30,000, or 50,000, and you could approach them as a unit, as a collective. So if you had any preventive work you wanted done, or vaccinations done, or treatment of any of the chronic diseases done, it was very simple to handle them as a unit. And that's where most of the eradication of diseases really climaxed into a dramatic result. For example, it was already by that time that we'd got rid of smallpox, cholera, plague, venereal disease, Kala-Azar. To eliminate venereal diseases is like one of the prime things to do is to change the social system. You have to cut out the economic roots of prostitution. You have to raise the living standards of the people. You have to educate them. In China, they were more at a disadvantage because you had the whole feudal oppression of women. But when women are sold into prostitutions from early childhood and people making money and profit out of this, and the morals of a society degenerating around a money nexus, you're not going to be able to eradicate this.
No.
With the youth growing up and having a new ideals and new moral incentives and commitments and so forth, women being liberated, marriage laws taking effect, the economic equality of women being recognized and worked out, the roots were cut out again, and the people were very cooperative. We treated them with regular antibiotics, penicillin, and the other treatments. That was quite simple. The technical parts are quite simple.
The other tremendous problem in China, surely, was drugs, opium. What is the situation in regard to opium today?
Well, it was a terrible problem to start with. And by the time of liberation, this problem was much more extensive because the armies back and forth, Japanese penetration throughout the country. But at the beginning, after liberation, one of the first things that was done was to stop opium growing completely. And then we set up medical clinics for treatment. And fortunately, opium was much easier to handle. Opium addiction was easier to handle. We used, one of the very cheap methods was just using magnesium sulfate solutions, 25% in injections. That would give a relaxation of the muscles and help tide over part of the thing, and extremely cheap. And feasible, acceptable to the addicts, and easily delivered by the medical personnel or paramedical personnel.
Dr. Ma told me that the Cultural Revolution gave a big impetus to the medical profession. For example, several new applications were found for the old practice of acupuncture. Though the incidence of polio is very low in China, acupuncture is now being used to help those paralyzed by polio, like this boy. The Chinese doctors claim that acupuncture is helping polio patients to recover more quickly. This teenage boy was also severely paralyzed by polio. After 20 minutes, the needles were withdrawn, and the patient practices walking. Another entirely new use of acupuncture is for severe spinal injuries caused by industrial accidents. Most of these patients have been bedridden for many years. Others have been unable to move except in a wheelchair. Today, after a long course of deep acupuncture, some of these patients, the doctors told me, are regaining the partial use of their legs. Of course, the most dramatic medical breakthrough has been the discovery 3 or 4 years ago that acupuncture could be used as an anesthetic in operations. More than 500,000 major operations of this kind have now been performed. No one, even in China, quite understands how it works. Practice in this case has moved ahead of theory. It is quite common for patients to be given fruit during the operation to quench their thirst. I watched a dozen or more major operations in which the patients, with no sign of pain, remained quite conscious and could talk with me. It was an utterly astonishing experience. This was a relatively minor operation for a hernia. In the West, a general anesthetic would normally have been given. The patient was able to help himself off the operating table. I had a brief talk with him. You've just come off the operating table. How do you feel? Quite comfortable. Did you have any pain during the operation? No, not much pain. And there's some discomfort at all or not? No. Did you get thirsty? No. And it was quite a long operation. How long did it take? More than an hour. And you were quite conscious all the way through? He was conscious, yes. I mean, you were quite conscious all the way through the... Yeah, and you could talk. I saw you being fed oranges, yes. And you're now going back to your ward, and when do you think you'll be able to have an ordinary meal?
You can have it right now.
Oh, you can have it right now? Oh, are you hungry? You're hungry, yes. These children are deaf, or almost deaf. They were either born deaf or lost their hearing when they were very young. Most of them, when they came to this school, could not speak, and it is known as a school for deaf mutes. It is one of about 15 such schools run by the Army Medical Corps. Recently, during the Cultural Revolution, the Army medical people began to think that acupuncture might be able to restore, at least partially, the hearing of deaf children. Both Western and Chinese medical advisors have said that this treatment is still experimental and should not raise the hopes of deaf people. It may be some years before it can be properly assessed and applied outside China. From time to time, the Army doctors test the children's hearing.
注意，开始。倒记下来没有？记了。注意，开始。再来一次。
As the children begin to hear, they must also learn how to speak, and must learn to recognize differences in pitch. These children have been here for only a few months. Most will stay for 3 years. Former students sometimes come back to the school to share their experiences. This girl says she is now able to go to a normal school. This older boy tells how he was taught to read blueprints. He is now making wooden molds at a steel factory. None of them speak quite normally, but they can be readily understood. This girl welcomes us to a student show. Chinese medical workers are the first to admit that there is still much to do. Today, the average life expectancy in China is just twice what it was before the revolution. So now they say they must give more attention to the growing number of older people, a problem that arises from the extraordinary improvement in the general health of the Chinese population.